Welcome to The Explainer. Have you ever wondered what could possibly make someone completely flip their political identity? Well, today we're going to dive into a pretty powerful story about just that. A journey from being liberal to identifying as center-right, all driven by the super intense political climate of the last decade. It's a fascinating look at ideology, identity, and, the forces that really shape what we believe.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the timeline of this political shift. Then, we're going to get into the three big catalysts for this change. A rejection of what the speaker calls victimhood politics, the kind of surprising politicization of health, and a challenge to some established scientific narratives. And finally, we'll see how all these threads weave together to paint this picture of a vanishing middle ground in politics today.
So how in the world does a move from Sydney, Australia to America lead to a complete political overhaul? Well, it all kicks off when a deeply held identity gets challenged by a brand new and incredibly different political landscape.
Now that's a really powerful word the speaker uses, radicalized. But they don't mean it in the sense of moving to a political extreme. No, they're really trying to highlight the sheer speed and the intensity of their change in perspective right after moving from Australia to the US.
And the timing of this move is absolutely crucial. Arriving in 2015 meant landing in the US just as the 2016 presidential election was really heating up. The speaker describes this whole period as a fever pitch of what they term woke ideology. And it created a political environment that was just so intense and so unfamiliar that it forced them to reevaluate pretty much everything they thought they believed.
All right, so this brings us to the first major reason for this whole shift. And it really centers on a deep, fundamental disagreement with what the speaker saw as a core part of the Democratic Party's message back then.
Wow, this quote, it really cuts right to the heart of the issue, doesn't it? For the speaker, this wasn't just some simple policy disagreement. It was this deep, almost visceral rejection of a political narrative that they felt prioritized blame over personal agency, and one that they ultimately saw as disempowering. So, to really get their perspective, we need to understand this key concept they use, the oppression Olympics. This is their term for a political dynamic where it seems like different groups are all competing for the status of being the most victimized, and that's a dynamic they found incredibly alienating.
So here's the bottom line. For the speaker, this focus on victimhood wasn't just some political strategy. It was a whole philosophy they just fundamentally rejected. This right here became the single biggest factor that, as they put it, pushed me over, and it made them feel like their old political home just didn't fit anymore. And, this feeling of alienation, it didn't just stop with identity politics. It actually got more intense when the speaker saw seemingly non-political topics, like personal health, get totally caught up in the same partisan crossfire.
The speaker really raises this fundamental question. I mean, think about it. Why should things like nutrition, exercise, or even just questioning the ingredients in our food, why should that be viewed through a left versus right lens? And this slide is a perfect example of their point. The speaker uses RFK Jr.'s slogan, "Make America Healthy Again," to illustrate this whole thing. They argue that the core idea, tackling issues like obesity, processed foods, and the influence of Big Pharma, that should appeal to everyone, right? But instead, they saw it get instantly framed and dismissed along partisan lines, which they describe as a symptom of political brain rot.
And the speaker gives a bunch of examples of this trend. They talk about seeing articles that actually link fitness and even bodybuilding to the far right, an idea they found just completely absurd. From questioning processed foods to scrutinizing the pharmaceutical industry, they argue that these topics should be open for healthy debate, not turned into partisan weapons.
So, building on that theme, we come to the third key piece of this puzzle, a perceived resistance to questioning established narratives, especially when it comes to science and medicine.
To really illustrate this point, the speaker describes a specific interaction they saw about COVID-19 vaccines between politicians Elizabeth Warren and RFK Jr. And for the speaker, this exchange about science and political promises, it became a real crystallizing moment. So as the speaker describes it, this exchange basically pitted new scientific data against a prior political promise. For them, it was just a crystal clear example of political commitments completely overriding scientific reason, and it really solidified their concerns.
So at the end of the day, what this really boils down to is a call for intellectual consistency. The speaker is asking, why should it be controversial to re-examine evidence or to demand better studies? They argue that this kind of rigorous scientific inquiry is absolutely essential, and it should be welcomed, no matter who's asking the questions.
So, where does all this lead? Well, when you combine the rejection of that victimhood narrative, the politicization of health, and the resistance to questioning scientific orthodoxy, you get to the speaker's pretty powerful conclusion about our modern political world.
And this really captures the personal cost. You see, it's not just some abstract political debate, it actually affects relationships. The speaker is describing a social dynamic where any little deviation from a strict ideological line immediately gets you labeled as an extremist on the other side.
And really, this is the ultimate takeaway from the speaker's entire journey. Even though they still hold what they call lefty ideas, they feel like there's just no room for that kind of nuance anymore. The political landscape has become this binary choice, and it's basically erased the space for anyone who doesn't fit neatly into one camp or the other. And so, this individual's journey from left to center-right, it isn't just one person's story. It's a reflection of a much larger political landscape. It leaves us with a really critical question. In a world that increasingly demands we choose a side, 100%, what happens to nuance, to independent thought, and to the millions of people who find themselves caught somewhere in the middle? Maybe the most radical act today isn't choosing a side, but refusing to.